You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. As the war in Ukraine approaches its second anniversary and Israel escalates its offensive on Hamas and Hezbollah, 2024 is looking like it's going to be another dangerous year for journalists on the front lines. While reporting in war zones is an inherently dangerous job, governments taking journalists hostage to be used as political pawns is another disturbing trend. In March 2023, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich was detained by Russia's Federal Security Services under suspicion of espionage. The arrest marked the first time an American journalist has been charged for spying in Russia since the Cold War. How can we better protect journalists under threat abroad? And why does their safety matter to the health of a free press? Soon, we'll hear from Evan's editor at the Wall Street Journal. But first, we're going to revisit my April 2023 conversation with Gulnoza Saeed. She's the Europe and Central Asia Program Coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists, an organization devoted to protecting the lives and well-being of reporters around the world and safeguarding their freedom to work. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Who is Evan Gershkovich, and what should listeners know about his work and his background?
Evan Gershkovich is an American journalist who, until recently, worked in Russia for the Wall Street Journal, and he was detained on March 29, and the following day he was charged with espionage. He is the first American journalist to be charged with espionage since 1982, since practically the Cold War. And it's one of the biggest press freedom cases for us at CPJ because of the seriousness of the charges.
What reason has the Russian government given for Gershkovich's detention?
Well, Russian authorities don't usually give reasons or explanations when they detain journalists, which is a very widely used practice because their goal is to silence independent voices, and that's exactly the real reason behind Gershkovich's arrest. And because he's charged with espionage, we're not likely to know the details of the case. He's got two lawyers. Those lawyers had to sign non-disclosure agreements, so they cannot even speak to colleagues or family of Evan about the details of the case and the charges.
So even in court under the Russian system, we won't hear, the world won't hear what it is the government alleges he did in order to justify a charge of espionage?
The lawyers will hear that, but you and I and many Russians won't be allowed to a courtroom because these kind of trials are held behind closed doors and very little details are usually known about the charges.
How's he holding up? Do we know? Has he been able to speak to anybody who can then either speak to CPJ or the authorities at the Wall Street Journal or to the State Department about how he's being treated in custody?
Well, he's been able to speak to his lawyers, and also finally the U.S. ambassador and members of the consulate in Moscow were able to visit him in detention, and they also saw him in the courtroom. And he said that he was fine, healthy, and he was exercising and trying to write fiction, not nonfiction, not journalistic materials, because obviously that could be used against him, you never know, with Russians. And he was also able to send a quick note written in Russian, and he is able to receive letters. And the Wall Street Journal organized a campaign so everyone can send a letter to Evan in detention. Those letters have to be physical letters, like printed on paper and written in Russian. So the Wall Street Journal organized the translation of those letters, and we're in touch with the journal all the time.
What's different or similar about Gershkovich's case from previously detained journalists? Russians arrest journalists all the time. Is the prominence of his publication unusual? Is the international access of his organization unusual. And why the particular charge of espionage, as opposed to the many other things the Russians can accuse journalists of doing?
Well, the answer to your last question is something only Russian authorities can give, probably Putin, because as far as we understood from the reports, Putin had been made aware of the case before Gershkovich was detained, and he sort of approved the detention and the charges. So the instructions came from the highest level in Russia. I don't know why the espionage charges. I can't say that. But he is definitely a very prominent journalist who has been covering stories that the Russian authorities didn't want to be covered. They have been trying to silence journalists in Russia for decades, but especially after Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Evan wrote about Putin's circle. He wrote about the impact of the Western sanctions on the Russian economy, and he spoke to ordinary Russians, asking them questions about how their lives has changed since the sanctions were introduced. He also traveled to neighboring countries like Kazakhstan and Georgia and spoke to a lot of anti-war Russians who relocated to those countries after the full-scale invasion. So those were exactly the stories that the Russian authorities, including Putin, didn't want to be published, and their goal from this case is to silence him.
It's been widely reported outside Russia that there are all kinds of restrictions on what you can legally call the invasion of Ukraine, what to call the war there. Has it meant new challenges, a new set of obstacles to be navigated for reporters working inside Russia? In the last 14 months, have you had to be much more careful about what you said and how you said it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. After the February 24th, 2022, we saw quite a few independent media outlets condemning the war. But then a few days later, the Russian legislature amended the laws and made it practically illegal to call the war a war and to use the word occupation, for example, and they instructed all media to describe the conflict in Ukraine as a special military operation. And anybody who dared to still describe the conflict as the war, which it is, was under the risk of being prosecuted criminally on charges of distributing fakes. So what happened is that a lot of journalists fled Russia. A lot of Russian journalists fled Russia. A lot of foreign correspondents initially relocated from Russia elsewhere because they wanted to see how the law would impact them, foreign press corps. Some of them went back, including Evan, and continued reporting. And there was this hope that if the Russian authorities wanted to persecute them, that the ways to do so would not be as serious as the charge of espionage. So that's why I'm saying that Evan's case is the most serious and prominent one, and also it was quite unexpected. Not the prosecution of an American journalist or a foreign journalist in general, but the charges were quite surprising for me.
Have there been either harassments or detentions or charges against foreign journalists working for media outlets in other countries? Naturally, we hear a lot about Evan Gershkovich here in the United States because he works for the Wall Street Journal. Are there French or Egyptian or Turkish or any other journalists who have been under state sanction in a similar way since the war began?
Local journalists have obviously been more vulnerable to repressions of the Russian authorities. And as I said, many of them, probably hundreds, have fled, but many have been in Russian jails. When we at CPJ conducted our most recent prison census in December 2022, there were 19 journalists in Russian jails, and that's the highest number ever since we at CPJ started keeping record in 1992. As to foreign correspondents, yes, we have seen cases when their accreditations were not renewed or visas were not renewed, so they had to go back to their home countries. And even before the full-scale invasion, we have seen cases, and we documented the cases of journalists, including Americans or those who had dual American and Russian citizenship, who were harassed and persecuted, but not charged with espionage.
How does CPJ handle itself in a case like this? Naturally, normally, you don't want to be perceived as being in partnership with a government. But certainly the United States government is implicated when one of its citizens is arrested abroad. How do you handle yourself? Have you been in communication with the State Department, with the United States government, with the Wall Street Journal? Is it part of CPJ's toolkit to jump into action and talk to everybody?
You pointed out it very correctly that CPJ is a non-governmental organization, and we're not part of any government, and we don't receive any funds from any government in the world. So even if it is an intergovernmental organization that's organizing a conference and invites me, CPJ would pay for my tickets and hotel. We are that strict in those ethical terms. And when it comes to advocacy, we do advocacy with governments in many different countries around the world, including the United States. What is different in this case is probably the very fact that Evan Gershkovich is the U.S. citizen. But other than that, I think we are working with them as we would with any other governments if a journalist from any other country was detained.
It's hard to understand at first glance what the Russians gain from this. I mean, we're not going to find out less about Russia because one man has been detained. But longer term, if Russia is looking at this as part of a long game, does it send a chill through the entire foreign press corps? Does it make people more cautious about what they write? Does it make international organizations less likely to cover Russia fearlessly and forthrightly? Can the Russians sort of strategize around this, taking down somebody from a prominent international organization and saying, this is a shot at everybody who does this work. Watch yourself.
Send a chilling message to other foreign correspondents working in Russia? Definitely yes. And I know of journalists who started considering leaving Russia, and a foreign photographer who was working with Evan on his most recent story, unfinished story, decided to flee Russia. So eventually, this is the first very prominent case, but there could be the next, and nobody is immune from repressions. Now it is very clear. And what is also clear is that the charges are likely to be very serious, especially if you come from a country that's been critical of Russia and Russian invasion of Ukraine and has been supportive of Ukraine and providing Ukraine with aid, like the United States. So eventually, also, one aspect that you didn't touch on your question is that journalists like Evan also provided a platform for many Russians to be heard. And what is going to happen now after those ordinary Russians watch Russian TV and hear about an American journalist who turned out to be a spy, well, if you repeat the official narrative in Russia, then they're going to probably think twice before they speak to another foreign correspondent, even if that person comes and shows their accreditation with the foreign ministry and says, I'm a foreign journalist. They're going to be very careful. And that's the worst part, because there are fewer and fewer platforms for the ordinary Russians to speak out, to say anything critical of the authorities, and for us, you and me and the rest of the world, to know what exactly is going on the ground in Russia.
Along with the Committee to Protect Journalists, Others have fiercely denounced the Gershkovich arrest. For example, Jason Rezaian, who, as Washington Post Tehran bureau chief, was held in Evin prison for over a year, says stop calling him under arrest. Stop calling him a suspect. Call him what he is, a hostage, someone who's been taken by a foreign government for reasons quite apart from any serious legal case against them. Do you agree with that nomenclature? Is it right to call Evan Gershkovich a hostage, as Jason Rezaian suggests we do?
Absolutely. And Jason knows it. The hostage policies of some autocratic states like Iran and Russia. And I agree that Evan Gershkovich is a hostage of the Russian state. In recent years, what we've seen is that it was state actors rather than non-state actors who took journalists hostage. And journalists held in detention in Russia are exactly hostage of the regime because they did nothing wrong but exercised their freedom of speech, but were punished for it. And Evan Gershkovich is not just a hostage, but he is also a bargaining chip. Russia is going to try to get as much benefit from this case as possible in its negotiations with the West.
Now, people may be more familiar with violence against journalists in countries like Mexico or Libya or Syria. Can you give us an overview of sort of the state of play in your program area? You're the director for Europe and Central Asia. How are press freedoms looking in your area of responsibility?
Well, I cover a lot of countries, more than 50 countries. Among them are the world's worst jailers of journalists, like Turkey, Belarus, Russia, Tajikistan, with dozens of journalists being held behind bars for their reporting that the authorities in their countries didn't like. Russia has also seen one of the highest numbers of journalists killed in direct retaliation for their work, especially under Putin. Since we at CPJ started keeping record in 1992, more than 80 journalists have been killed. 38 of them were murders, contract-style murders, including one of an American journalist, by the way. And only in 2 of those cases full justice has been achieved. So Russia has had a dire press freedom record even before Evan Gershkovich's case. So has Turkey, and I already mentioned Belarus, which held at least 26 journalists behind bars when we did our prison census in December, and it was the 5th largest jailer of journalists in the world. It was never easy to work as a journalist in Belarus, but after the contested presidential elections of 2020 and mass detentions of protesters, if you remember, the authorities have been not just detaining journalists, but bringing very serious charges of extremism against them. There are a lot of journalists who don't get necessary medical treatment in Belarusian jails. It's very difficult to do advocacy on Belarus because the authorities in Belarus are not listening to anybody except for Russia. And Russia itself has a dire press freedom and human rights situation. And last year, Ukraine was obviously one of the top countries where a lot of journalists were killed in the conflict. We documented 15 cases. At least 13 of them were killed while news gathering and reporting, and there were local journalists and foreign journalists among them. And Central Asia has never been free. I already mentioned Tajikistan, which has at least 7 journalists jailed behind bars and is the top jailer of journalists in the region of Central Asia. But in other countries of the region, the situation also has been dire for decades, ever since these countries became independent after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So, to tell you the truth, this is a very difficult and challenging region to cover if you work in press freedom like I do.
What can members of the general public do? If you're sitting at home and listening to our conversation, if you value not only the freedom to cover the news here in the United States, but to cover it around the world, both for foreign audiences and for domestic audiences, you might be thinking, well, I wish I could do something, but I'm just a reader. I'm just a listener. I'm just a viewer. What can I do? Are people powerless? Is there something they can actually do that's practical, helpful, important?
Well, people are not powerless, definitely not in the United States, because we see a lot of people helping us by donating to us so we can keep going and helping journalists. As you know, we provide financial grants to journalists in emergency situations. That's one way of helping. Obviously, help journalists themselves by reading their articles, clicking on their articles, watching their broadcasts and such. There are ways to help journalists through various means, and a lot of journalists need your help. This morning, I spoke to two Ukrainian journalists. One of them is in Kharkiv, and she lived under occupation for 4 months, and her home city was under occupation for 6 months in total. And another one is originally from Mariupol, and he had to flee to a safer area of Ukraine. Both of them continue working, and one of them is a chief editor of a newspaper. And because there are problems with electricity and the internet, people started reading newspapers. And she doesn't cover the war itself, but covers very basic news, like where volunteers can volunteer, what kind of work to do, when there will be power cutoffs and things like that. Very practical information that everybody needs. I'm used to talking to people in difficult situations, to journalists, but listening to their stories broke my heart because they were two of so many Ukrainian journalists who continue working despite all the difficulties, amidst the sirens, amidst shelling and bombing. Those who want to help can help. Ukrainian media, Belarusian media, exiled Russian media, many media outlets, and the press freedom organizations like CPJ.
Well, Gulnoza Saeed, it was a pleasure speaking to you, and thanks for both the practical and the idealistic case for a world of press freedom. It is so important for people to value and protect the ability to work of journalists not only where they live and where they listen and consume news, but all over the world. It's essential for freedom. And thanks a lot to you and for the work of the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray. Thank you for having me.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. It's been 9 months since Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich was arrested and jailed in Russia, accused of espionage. His time behind bars has coincided with rising tension between the U.S. and Russia over a long list of issues, especially Washington's outspoken support for Ukraine since Putin's 2022 invasion. Ann Simmons joins me now, the Wall Street Journal's Moscow bureau chief. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks so much for having me, Ray.
Well, to start simply as possible, how's he doing?
Well, I have been reporting on Evan's story as a journalist, and from talking to the US ambassador to Russia, Lynn Tracy, who has been in to see Evan on several occasions, and most recently in December, the report is that he's doing okay. He's in high spirits, given the circumstances, of course, because these aren't easy circumstances.
You mentioned that the U.S. ambassador has been in to see him. She was in, as you say, in December. Is it important, from your point of view as the Moscow bureau chief, to continue to have high-level contacts like that, as a practical matter, to signal that the U.S. government is paying attention?
Well, the US government, from what we've also reported, has said that this is a priority, that the release of Evan Gershkovich and other Americans who are deemed wrongfully detained, and in Russia, that would include the former Marine and businessman Paul Whelan and also Radio Free Europe reporter Alsu Kurmasheva, that's a priority. So very much so, the Wall Street Journal has said The senior officials at the Journal have made very clear that they feel it's extremely important and extremely encouraged when the US government indicates that it is making this a priority.
What does the Russian government say your colleague did?
The Russian government and Russian authorities have not publicly released any proof of anything that Evan has done. Evan was in Moscow on a reporting assignment. He is an accredited or was an accredited journalist, accredited by the Russian Foreign Ministry, and doing his job, doing journalism. The Russian government has made accusations against him, which of course the Journal and the US government have vehemently denied.
It's been reported the Russians are looking for what they call a mutually acceptable resolution to this situation. Any idea what they're talking about?
It's really difficult to know what's inside the heads of Russian authorities, and in particular Vladimir Putin. Very much the Russians have said, and President Putin himself has said, that the Russians are willing to come to some kind of agreement that is favorable to both sides. They have not publicly indicated what that might be. In terms of how the legal system works there, Evan could be kept in pretrial detention for 12 months, for a year, at which time investigators could actually request an extension. We do not know in what direction that is going at this particular juncture. January 30th will mark 10 months since Evan Gershkovich was detained. That mark is basically an extension of his pretrial detention. Before January 30th, Russian investigators, will either decide that they have gathered enough material to take this case to trial, or they could indeed extend his detention once again.
The rules are sort of a technicality often in Russia. They sometimes seem to be made up as they go along. But there is some interest, as there often is in societies like that, in following form. What have the preliminary hearings been like? Has he had a chance to enter a plea? For an American trying to make sense of what the Russians are up to, what form has this taken since his arrest?
What typically happens, Ray, is that an individual is kept in pretrial detention, and every 2 or 3 months, investigators can decide whether or not they have enough evidence to take a case to trial, or whether or not they want to continue extending the pretrial detention period. Now, because of the nature of this case, it's been held behind closed doors. And the only opportunity typically to see Evan in a courtroom is when an appeal has been submitted on his behalf, and it's at an appeal hearing. So there have been opportunities to actually see Evan in the courtroom in one of these glass boxes, or sometimes in a cage, and we see him there. He's very stoic in terms of the kind of impression he gives, and certainly the US ambassador has said publicly that he is being really strong and quite upbeat about this, as hard as the situation is. You know, the Russian investigators do have the opportunity to extend the pretrial period. In the case of Paul Whelan, for example, his pretrial detention was, I believe, somewhere in the range of 18 months before his case went to trial. I'm sure the Wall Street Journal certainly does not want that to be the case for Evan. Again, this is up to the Russian government. As you have mentioned, sometimes the rules don't always fall in place or follow. The Russians have said, though, that they are following their justice system and that they will go with their rules. They have also said that they wouldn't entertain any kind of prisoner swap, for example, until there is a verdict in a trial.
You are, as I mentioned, the Moscow bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal, so you have an institutional interest. Along with your journalistic one, you want to protect your own reporters. Is Russia simply becoming a more dangerous place to be a reporter?
It's a very difficult place to be a reporter right now, not just for foreigners, but also for Russian journalists because of the level of repression. The Russian government authorities have introduced rules that basically silence a free press. It's very difficult to say there is an independent media now in Russia. Certainly, a lot of Western news organizations have decided to limit their presence in Russia, having their reporters go in and out on assignment. It is a difficult place to report right now, but one which still requires and deserves the attention, of course, of Western news organizations, because all roads lead to Russia. Everyone wants to know what's going on in Russia. Certainly, I do feel that Western news organizations will likely continue to cover Russia to the extent that they can.
What do you have to be careful about when you're embarking on an assignment in Russia these days?
I think any journalist wanting to go into Russia, to report in Russia these days, has to be obviously very aware of the risks. There is a threat to journalism, to practicing journalism in Russia. So it's something that there's got to be a lot of conversation and a lot of talk before any journalist goes into Russia today, knowing that you want to be able to speak the truth. You want to be able to report what you see. You want to ensure that you are not spouting propaganda. And unless you can do that, then you shouldn't be going into Russia. So it's a very difficult situation to be in right now. The Russian authorities have made it very difficult to cover the news objectively, fairly, or at all for that matter.
Do you assume that they know where you are all the time when you're out reporting? Do you assume that they know who you're talking to and what you're talking about? I mean, I've been lucky. I've done a lot of stories in a lot of places around the world, but rarely have had to worry about whether the authorities are going to get mad at me and clap me in jail.
I think definitely to a certain extent, yes, of course. You've got to be aware that you are being watched or your communications are being monitored. I think that's a given in any authoritarian state in terms of trying to report. You've got to be aware that, yeah, perhaps you are being followed. And just keep that in mind. Certainly, there is risk also to the people you speak to in authoritarian states because they are very, very cautious these days. I can speak to Russia. Many Russians are very cautious about speaking to Western journalists today because they know there could be consequences to that. There are rules now that say that you cannot call the war a war. You have to call it a special military operation. You cannot criticize Russian government policy. You cannot say that the Russian military is committing any kind of violations in Russia. All of those types of things could actually get you locked up. And people are very aware of that.
What can just a regular person in the United States do, if anything? Is there anything, an American who thinks, gee, I don't want reporters being arrested for doing their jobs in foreign countries. What can anybody do?
I think it's a matter of speaking up for the rights of journalists and stomping that there needs to be a free press. Certainly making that clear to your Congress people that a free press is extremely important. And also impressing, I suppose, on the administration, on the US administration, that bringing Americans who have been wrongfully detained home should remain a priority.
Ann Simmons is the Wall Street Journal's Moscow bureau chief. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you, Ray.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian and Sienna Barnes. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. And I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.